At least 50% off in the sales, and a similar cut, probably more, is being aimed at investors in Greek public debt. For the people of Greece and the euro itself, this depression has taken a new ugly turn. Hedge funds are disrupting the talks, and they could cash in on it all, making big profits. The Greek debt pile amounts to around $453 billion. It has to be reduced by $128 billion by the end of the month. If investors agree to the losses, Greece can pay off more than $18 billion on bonds by the March deadline. If there's no agreement, it's a default, bankruptcy. The hedge funds can win whatever happens. They've bought bonds at cheap prices, and they took out what are called CDSs, credit default swaps, insurance against the default. Say you rent a car, you take out an insurance policy against a crash. What the hedge funds are doing are effectively betting on that crash happening with the CDS, even though it's called insurance. And not only that, it isn't just one car. They can insure as many as they want. They don't have to drive them. But even if there isn't a crash, they could still gain. Economists say with hedge funds having cheap bonds and CDSs, they have it both ways. The result, an obstacle to the bondholder talks.
The hedge funds are pressurizing, they are bargaining with the official sector, and they have from a very strong position. Because what they say is, if you don't give us what we're asking for, we're going to trigger off the CDSs, the insurance contracts that would bankrupt the banks that issued them.
This analyst in London believes the biggest challenge to the deal is agreeing on an interest rate. But it's further complicated by the hedge fund's standoff.
People have gone into the market and tried to benefit from it. It's quite an obscure, perhaps not terribly transparent market for some of us. And we also don't really know who the various creditors are, because there's been so much activity going on in the secondary market.
Like the collapsed retail trade in Greece, losses may well end up being accepted by the main body of debt investors. But the hedge funds could still argue it isn't voluntary, and they could go to the courts in the hope of massive settlements. A car crash might be avoided, but the Greek economy will continue limping along with vulture trading intent on making big money out of the misery.
Let's talk more to Andrew, live in Athens for us now. If I can say this, Andrew, a really good report to explain what actually has to be done, because we all focus on the Troika, the European Commission, the European Union, the IMF, who are looking at Greece. But this is what Greece has to do. This is the hard yards it's got to do to please the Troika, effectively, isn't it?
It certainly is, Kamal. It's remarkably complicated. On the one hand, I suppose, getting away from the finance speak, these private bondholders are basically getting IOUs. They're getting IOUs with the government. They're settling for a longer term. There's a renegotiation over all the debt. It's all being basically boiled down to a smaller sum. They're taking a 50% cut, but then that gets higher in real terms when you take into account interest rates and other factors. And what you have really with this whole position with the hedge funds, some describe it as a sideshow, but it isn't really, because they're causing disruption, and a default is in their interest. And even if there isn't a default, there's a question mark over this so-called voluntary aspect to what was agreed in the Euro summit back in October the 26th about this so-called private investment solution, PSI. Basically, what we're facing now, Kamal, is a situation whereby there has to be some sort of resolution. There has to be an avoidance of a default. And Lucas Papadimos is now sitting down talking to the Institute of International Finance. Charles de Lara, flown in from Washington to head his delegation, the main players in all of this, and they've got to come down to a solution. The main point is the interest rates. The government's pushing its belief for around 2% on these bonds, these IOUs, and the actual investors want much more, up to 5%, possibly more. And now there could be a solution, there could even be a fudge, but there's so much riding on this.
It must be tough, Andrew, for the Greek people. We were just running some pictures next to you of the protests. For them, all they can see is job cuts and higher taxes. And there's so much, as you've said, complicated stuff going on behind them, which the everyday Greek person probably goes straight over their head. No disrespect to them.
Well, there's a mood of absolute revulsion about the news on these so-called vulture funds. People of Greece are set for another round of austerity measures, and then a spin from Lucas Papadimos, a former banker, saying that he wants to revitalise the economy to try and push for more growth. by cutting wages in the private sector even more. He's just actually come away from talks with union bosses over this next round of really cutbacks and measures to try and reduce, to actually reform taxes as well, the tax system, in order to qualify for this $165 billion second tranche in emergency funds from the European Union and the IMF. And that, of course, those talks are going extremely badly. And he can't even get to the stage of getting that money unless he's successful in these talks with the private investors. It's a big mess.
Great stuff. Andrew Simmons live for us in Athens there. Thank you, Andrew.